Thank you. It's the first time I've seen this on a large screen, and it looks fantastic. I also loved a comment that I guess is a real curator and artist. All the film clips that you talk about, you actually have the running times to the second, and if it's video, if it's film, it's said rather than just the title. So I appreciate that, and I'm sure others do. I'm going to just start with a question and then throw it out to all of you so we can get in as many questions as we can. And I'm not really sure to begin because I have so many questions. But let me just start with this, asking about you. Do you see, because you're a curator and art historian by trade or history, and do you see filmmaking as sort of a natural progression in curating? Is this a way of curating for you?
I think filmmaking is my practice now, and I've been evolving toward that for the last decade. And it's the place where I can actually exploit my strange skill set. It brings all of the things together, all of my obsessions and passions and fascinations. So yes, I think it's my practice, and it's been going toward that for a while now. And
then let me just ask, going into the film itself and about the art, and somebody does talk about the idea of photography and if it's good or not for this, and also there have been films made about these things. What do you make of this idea of, how many people could see this art, and what does film do if and the artists film some of it themselves?
Photography is a curious subject in the history of land art because there's so many contradictions about it. For instance, the artists Michael Heizer and Walter D. Maria, who took positions for and against over the decades. Early on, they were using photography in early video, for instance, and then later renouncing photography and refusing to let people photograph the works. Smithson, on the other hand, understood, I think, better than any of those artists, the power of media, and he was prolific as a writer, prolific as a presenter in making films and sharing his work and making himself accessible. And I think as a result of that, Smithson, in a way, biased the discourse of land art. So photography is an interesting conundrum, really. But I wanted to make the film to bring these sites to people's attention, and I think technology allows us to. I think in this instance, we did actually shoot for an immersive, experiential kind of filmmaking, and that's, I think, what we have. Yeah. So they probably would have shot for that too had they had the access to the technology.
Right, if they could have done that. All right, let's see if anybody here has any questions. And okay, all right. Go ahead.
In terms of the sites that you did choose to make new filming videography around, how did you select those?
How did you select the sites?
I really wanted to honor some of the great work that had been done, and for instance, I really wanted to own the look of the period media, the early video, for instance, that grainy quality, that lo-fi look. And for instance, with Spiral Jetty, which I think is a masterful work, why try to better it? It's such an incredible work. And on the other hand, Double Negative had never really been properly photographed, and so that's what drove those decisions. If there was extant footage that was really beautiful and fascinating and period and told the story, I didn't want to try to outdo that. Nancy Holt's film, for instance, another example of that. Charles Ross's Star Axis, which is plays a minor part in the film, we did do an extensive shoot there too because it hadn't really been adequately photographed with the kinds of technology and with the aesthetic ambition that I had as a director.
How much in shooting this art and covering these artists, it seems to me you're not just doing a film about the art, but also about a point in time of these artists, an era, as it were. Was that also part of your plan?
Well, the film had been gestating for a long time. I felt like I wanted to make the film and get it out now because I felt the story needed to be told now because of what is happening in the contemporary art world. This very super highly commodified, hyper-speculative contemporary art market where it seems that money seems to be one of the top conversation points and market, et cetera. And I wanted to share the story with a younger generation of artists, but it is, to answer the question, a period piece, because these artists were responding to various things happening in the culture, the zeitgeist, the Vietnam War, the assassinations, the riots, popular culture, science fiction, filmmaking, all of those things play a part of it. To what extent each artist is responding to various things, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Some of them are not responding at all. They're on their own.
Yeah, and you talk about what the art world is like today, and some people do talk about it there. It's interesting. The other night we were showing a documentary that Walter Salles made about the Chinese filmmaker Zhang Shike, and it's a lovely documentary. And one of the viewers said to him, "Who's your audience for this? Like, who's going to see this?" And I saw the idea. Right? What do you do with this film? How do you make money from it? Like, who will see it? Who will pay to see it? And of course, people will. And I wonder about, you talk a little bit about it in the film, this idea of what did the artist see in terms of what they would get, not necessarily even in terms of money, but in terms of some feedback or,
I think Germano Celant hit it pretty accurately about eternality, putting something out that's just so ambitious and so over the top and seemingly impossible. There was no market for that work. There was not a lot of money, as Dennis Oppenheim says. They did get some support, like Virginia Dwan's support, but it was a very huge challenge to envision these works and then to actually manifest them. So I think it has to do with leaving a mark on art history and doing something that's really beyond trying to be original. That's a challenge. How does one be original? Yeah. It was difficult then. It's even more difficult now, when we all walk around, the streets with cell phones in our pockets and think we're, filmmakers or photographers. So it's that aspect that I was interested in too, in sharing like the spirit of these artists. I wanted to recapture that spirit. Who's going to, launch off from New York City and go out to the desert today and risk their life to make work? I mean, I'm not saying there are artists doing that, but let's look at these people and honor this incredible vision and ambition to do something.
And really what we're talking about, yes, the idea, and everything else is later, but it's that big idea. Yes?
I was wondering, I've seen some of Charles Ross's work in Star Axis, and you mentioned you take a lot of film. Do you perhaps see in the future you make another film?
Would you make another film like this? You have a lot of material on Ross, for instance.
I don't think so, no. My next film is about fashion, drugs, and disco in Paris in the 70s. I'll always be fascinated by these artists, but no, I don't believe so.
Yes.
Hi, my question is about your part of the filmmaking process and how you came to choose the genre of music that you chose and how you saw that as representative and corresponding to, the essence of your own works.
Yes. Talk about your choice of music in making.
We have a music supervisor who's also the editor, who I work extremely closely with, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the kinds of music. It starts off with just the conversation and then the thematics and kind of just the anchor points of the film. And I wanted something that was atmospheric, and so it's all a process of just listening and licensing. And it's a challenge. It takes a lot of time, and it's so subjective, and it drives you mad. But I think we got a nice balance of sound. And we also had an incredible sound engineer named Rick Ash, and Gary Geegan is his collaborator in Hollywood, who's just a really very, very talented engineer who brought things to that sound mix. There's a lot of complexity to it, and hopefully you don't pay attention to it, but it's there. It's embedded in the audio. Thank you.
Yes.
I had a question. I assume you tried to get Michael Heizer in the film, and he's obviously an important person in the film and the city, which is important. I was just curious, how hard did you try? Does he know about this film, and does he think it's an important part of the conversation?
Well, talk about Michael Heizer vis-a-vis the film and getting.
It's a good question. The film, in some ways, began gestating in 2003 when I negotiated a very rare interview with Michael Heizer. It was a very challenging interview, as you would expect, but it wasn't. It was actually a productive interview, and I had lived in New Mexico for over a decade, And I made my first trip to the lighting field around 1995. So that's when I started, the ideas and the gestation period began. He's aware of the film. We actually made efforts to meet with him. Virginia Dwan and I were actually going to visit him together. I was going to pick her up in Las Vegas and rendezvous with her at the casino, and then drive over to his place in Garden Valley. But he would have nothing of it. He was absolutely against the film. And the film hews very, very closely to the period between 68 and 1973. And I like the idea of showing the artist contemporaneously. I mean, I would have been happy to have spoken with him, but he was not going to talk to me. And we just left it at that.
Did you know this like before or as you were making the film? Like before you started the film, were you hoping that he might, in this day and age, be a part of the film, or did this just happen as you were shooting, and then it didn't matter that he didn't want to be part of the film now?
I knew there would be challenges, I'll just say
Yeah.
that. And making films like this is you have to be very strategic. You have to be very strategic. You can't ask for permission because there'll be obstacles thrown in your way, and
You'll
people
never
start
make the
talking,
film.
they'll start
It'll never be
talking about
done.
your project prematurely. So he's a very challenging person, and I understand his need to finish the work at City. At one point I was thinking about shooting City, but then I realized that would be so antagonistic and I didn't want to go there. So we show City. It's represented in the early, the first part of it, Complex 1, which he did another contradiction. He allowed that to be photographed by BBC. So that's where I got that footage.
Yes.
Film speaks to the idea of these works relating to religion and pilgrimage. I was wondering if you kind of felt that sense of pilgrimage as you were visiting these sites, and also just if you could speak about the relationship.
Yeah, did you feel a sense of pilgrimage going to these sites? And yeah, talk a bit more about the idea of religion, almost spirituality.
Having made the film now, I think I like to urge people who've seen it to get in a car and do a road trip and go to these places, because photography absolutely does not replace the experience. The experience is it's overwhelming to go to sites like Double Negative and Spiral Jetty. I don't want to express too much. I will say that you really have this connection with the cosmos. You begin to feel insignificant, and the space is just overwhelming. And when we shot Double Negative, for instance, our helicopter crew, about 5 of us, there was not like a dry eye in the helicopter when we finished. They were just, because it was such a challenge to shoot on a really stormy day, and it was just so beautiful. It was like just overtook us. And so there is that feeling, there's that sense of the infinity and the void, and the metaphysical aspects cannot be downplayed. They're absolutely a part of that. And that's all I'll say, but I urge people to try to visit the sites and to do the road trip, because that's part of the piece too. That's the getting there and surviving the drive, et cetera, was intentionally thought of by people like Smithson and DeMaria. They wanted you to get out into these desolate places and to slow down, let time slow down, and perception is heightened, and everything is just so much more present sensorially. So that's all I'll say.
And also to see it, you said it was very stormy when you went. I feel like, oh my God, you'd have to see it under all sorts of weather conditions because the whole thing would change. I can just imagine.
Yeah, that shoot was tough because it was a really rare thunderstorm in Nevada, and it was my first time in a helicopter. It was really like, wow. I actually said, let's go down. They're like, no, we're going. But we were fortunate because I didn't really want a Kodak moment. I wanted something atmospheric. And what happened was, in that particular shoot, the rocks and the desert sand and all the surfaces became super saturated, and you can see there's water running through the arroyos, which you never see. And there was this dome of clouds which created this diffusion, and it was just fantastic. We were fortunate to have that opportunity.
Okay, just one more question, or maybe not. Yes, right here.
I enjoyed seeing the film. Thanks so much. And I had a question about gender in the film, because I think that it's very conspicuous are not only male artists, with the exception of Nancy Holt, but they're macho artists. And I was interested that you didn't talk about that in more explicit ways. And I found it really problematic that there was the inclusion of that clip of Wiener saying, oh, it had nothing to do with gender, that Nancy Holt wasn't a more famous artist. And I thought, why did you include that without sort of subverting it in some way?
And yes, this is a question about gender, about that Nancy Holt is obviously the only person. And yes, I saw that too, when, yes, Lawrence Weiner talks about it wasn't about gender, that some people just step back. Do you, I of course don't believe that. Do you believe that?
No, it's a good question, but first of all, I wanted the principal characters to tell the story. There's no voiceover. In fact, I debated that intro voiceover, but I decided it would be something for the viewer to hold on to at the beginning if you don't know anything about land art. I kept that clip in there because I did a very extensive interview with Lucy Lepard, who basically affirmed this. She said the same thing. And I didn't want to have to put in a voiceover describing Lawrence's comments, but I think it's evident that the machismo element's very evident. I mean, the cowboy, macho, gun shooting, land artist aspect is very clear. There's no need for me to do anything. And if you do the research on Nancy Holt, you see that she was incredibly involved in Bob's practice. She's integral, and I think that's evident in the film. So when Lawrence says she came into her own later, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And actually Bob said something to the effect right before he died, something very prophetic. He said, it's Nancy's turn now. And he died about 2 weeks later. So that's why.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I'm very glad that was our last question.
Good
Thank
question.
you very much for that question. Thank you very, very much for this film. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure
for
to be
your
here.
attention and your questions.